Cover crops are the hottest buzzwords in agriculture today. They may be part of the solution for water quality and erosion issues and may put extra money in the pockets of farmers. We'll take a look next on Show Me Ag. Welcome to Show Me Ag. I'm your host, Kyle Vickers. Cover crops have been used by farmers for generations, but only recently have become a hot topic in the agriculture community. Seen by some folks as a solution for water quality issues and erosion problems, they're more popular than ever. Farmers and researchers are finding the best combinations of varieties and the best practices to maximize the benefits. Sami Tellatin is with the SARE program at the University of Missouri and works to find some of these answers. Sami, thanks for coming and visiting with us tonight. First of all, let's find out a little bit about you and how you got into this particular area of agriculture.
Yes, well, thank you for having me. I studied bioengineering at the University of Missouri with the intention to go into the renewable energy field. But I worked on some independent studies of composting, and that really was kind of my gateway into learning about soil health. And from there, worked on a few farms throughout college and after I graduated, and really started to develop this passion for agriculture.
And now you're working in a sustainable agriculture field. That seems like a little bit of a departure from originally bioengineering. So tell us a little bit about how the SARE program works. That's where you're kind of focused right now, and then we'll talk a little bit more about the specifics.
Yes, so SARE is the Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education Program. It is a grant-funded program through the USDA that offers opportunities for farmers, extension associates, professionals, and graduate students to earn money for completing projects to do with sustainable agriculture. To date, I believe we funded over 600 projects since the 80s that have to do with cover crops and soil health, so that's exciting. And we also have a lot of resources online, books, bulletins, fact sheets about cover crops, soil health, and sustainable agriculture topics.
We've been aware for a long time, but soil health, water quality, all these issues are really maybe bubbling to the surface more than in the past. Talk to us a little bit about soil health and what that really means.
Yes, soil health is a very hot topic right now, as you're alluding to, because it means bolstering the productivity of our soils by feeding the soils. And when we think about soil health, we want to be thinking about microbial populations and earthworms and all of the things that go into a soil ecosystem or the soil biology. And we're also thinking about nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus and carbon. And we're thinking about soil's ability to allow rainfall to infiltrate, along with the ability of a soil to hold itself in place rather than eroding during weather events like rain.
A part of that is related to water quality. I know we really haven't maybe focused on that in Missouri as much as they have in Iowa, but boy, Iowa has some severe water quality problems downstream from all those very productive farms in Iowa.
Yes.
That's part of it as well, isn't it?
Yes, it's a huge part of it, and especially in the Midwest, we're thinking about water quality more from a farming standpoint and an education and outreach standpoint, because we're seeing issues in the Gulf of Mexico with hypoxia, where our nutrients from our farm fields have run off and are starting to concentrate there, and that's presenting a problem for the ecosystems and the fish and the shellfish that live in the Gulf of Mexico. So we can see these effects for a long way.
You said hypoxia. It's better known as the dead zone, which is a big area there off the Gulf where there's not much sea life because it's the organisms that are there die off and they kill everything off, right?
Yes,
pretty scary.
Definitely. It is really scary.
You also mentioned carbon. Part of this is carbon sequestration. Excuse me there. But anyway, which is a part of the global warming problem, and if we can hold that carbon on the earth, that has a lot of potential as well.
Yes, definitely. And when we think about carbon sequestration, whether or not we want to talk about global warming, we can get behind putting more carbon into our soil, because that's also building our organic matter, which has so many benefits for a farmer's yields and also just for the long-term viability of that field to produce food.
So how did you get into this particular area of cover crops? There's a lot of, we've talked about a lot of different things here, but you're really focused on that one issue.
Yes, so I've always been interested in environmental issues. And Cover crops are really amazing to me because they're kind of these ecosystem superheroes on our farms. We can see that they have so many unique benefits. They also have challenges depending on which species we use, but they really can benefit the environment as well as the farmer. So especially from a bioengineering standpoint, if we're thinking about the supply chain and we're thinking about the life cycle of the products we're producing, I think that cover crops are a really good way to make that supply more sustainable.
Well, let's talk a little bit about how cover crops differ. As I was driving in today, fantastic corn, we've had some rain, soybeans, wheat, those are the typical Missouri crops. So what's different about them and a cover crop?
What's different between corn and soy and a cover crop? Well, the time of year that they're grown at will be different, but the big differences are that many cover crops like cereal rye, as I know you're familiar with, are grasses. So they have large, deep-rooting root systems, which can really help to feed the soil and keep it in place. But cover crops are so diverse that I think though we might see a lot of differences between cover crops and corn and soy, we also can see a lot of similarities. Like crimson clover is a legume cover crop. Well, soy is also a legume crop, so those two plants are really good at taking nitrogen and fixing it into the soil.
Taking it out of the air and putting it into the soil.
Yes.
When I was young, which has now been a long time ago, that's one of our regular practices was using clovers, which we plowed back in because we weren't really using nitrogen fertilizer like we are today. But nitrogen fertilizer can also be a problem, right?
Right. Yes, it can. And one of the biggest problems with nitrogen fertilizer is the fact that those nutrients might not all become scavenged by the plants, and they might be prone to run off into our waterways. And also when we manufacture nitrogen fertilizer and use it on our fields, we're using a lot of energy to do that. So if we can offset that with cover crops, we might not have as big of a footprint.
So corn typically is planted in the spring and harvested in the fall. What's the timing for cover crops typically?
Typically in Missouri, we would plant our cover crops right after we harvest, or even a few weeks before we harvest corn or soybeans. And then we might have cover crops that winter kill, so they would stop growing in December or January. But they also might survive over the winter, and then we would terminate them before we plant our corn or our soybeans in the springtime.
So it's a fit in between the regular cropping rotation, and so you've got something growing. Tell me what that does for the soil.
It keeps it covered, which is something we really want.
Hence the word cover crop.
Yes, very apt.
It does more than that.
Yes, it does more than that. As I've mentioned before, those roots of the cover crops, when we're keeping them growing all year long, in addition to the corn and soy, we're feeding the soil microbial populations all year long. Some people are starting to describe the bacteria and the microorganisms in our soil by their weight, which can be up to a ton per acre. And so a ton of weight is equal to the weight of 2 cows, just about. Maybe you can attest to that.
So a ton of microbes, of little tiny unseeable organisms in the soil per acre.
Yes, and so thinking about keeping those microbes alive, well, we know that they need food. So by planting cover all year long, we can feed them all year long so that they can continue to work with us in our production.
And how important are those microbes? You mentioned soil health. How important are the microbes to soil health?
They are crucial. They're probably the key to the whole topic of soil health. We think about our bodies and how our bodies are a lot of different organs working together. Well, you can kind of think about the soil in that way too, that there's a lot of moving parts and it's an entire ecosystem that has to be sustained in order to be productive.
So those microbes are just a part of that as well. And then you're adding quite a lot of organic matter, depending on the product. You're adding organic matter to the soil, which is also important.
Yes, it's super important. For carbon sequestration, as you mentioned before, we can add biomass to decompose by planting cover crops like cereal rye, which is a grass that grows large volumes of biomass above the ground. But what's even more important is that we have that root biomass growing in the soil, and that also contributes to organic matter formation, even at deeper levels in the soil.
I saw a video this week of cereal rye root mass actually plugging up tile outlet systems, that there was such a mass of roots in the soil that it was actually plugging up, which is a problem, but also a very good thing to have that kind of organic matter in the soil.
Yes, that's exact. I saw that too, and that's what I thought. I was like, wow, this is not very good cover crop press, but at the same time, it shows what we want to see, which is that we have this root mass going on beneath the soil.
And I think there's a website that you've got that is going to have a lot of detail on cover crops. Well, let's try to go over some of these. You mentioned cereal rye, crimson clover. Let's talk about how each of these might work in a system.
Yes. So cereal rye is a grass and crimson clover is a legume, and they're not the only species that fall into those categories. But we also have brassicas and mustards, and we have the oilseed radish. I don't know if you've planted the radish.
Okay, you mentioned brassicas. Give me some examples. Turnips, are they
Turnips.
out? And we do use some turnips.
Yes.
Is kale a brassica?
I believe so, yes. Kale is a brassica.
Kale is very popular for people food,
Yes.
and we planted some in our garden this year, and it grew so fast I thought, boy, I wonder if that would work in a pasture. But those kinds of products can be a part of the mix as well.
Yes, and very good for cattle grazing, which is a bonus.
So you plant these, and you mentioned actually that some people plant this aerial apply seed ahead of harvest so that they get a head start.
Yes.
And we did plant some radishes one year, and they were amazing. And tell us a little bit about the benefits of the radish.
The radish is one of my favorites right now because it's really good at preventing soil compaction. So its really long taproot, which can be up to 2 feet in length, can really open the soil up. And it was actually under the St. Louis Arch in the fall of last year. I don't know if you saw this, but they planted oilseed radishes as a cost-effective way to rejuvenate and aerate the soil there. I thought that was so cool.
We tried that one year. Errol did it, and the turnips or the radishes were a foot long, and then there was a long root attached to them. It was quite a project, and we got a lot of attention from passersby as well.
I'm sure.
Cereal rye. Now, there's 2 or 3 different kinds of rye. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
I don't know much about the different types of rye. Okay. Maybe you can tell more than that.
Well, I know the cereal rye, the non-cereal rye, which is I think an Italian rye, is hard to get rid of it in a cropping system. So a person's got to be a little bit careful about the variety choice there.
Yes, definitely. And another thing to think about with cereal rye is when you're planting it in your rotation. For instance, I think farmers are seeing more benefits when they plant cereal rye before a soybean than if they planted it before corn.
Just the way the rotation works.
Yes, and the way that the nutrients are mapped out across time. I know that in the most recent SARE survey of cover crop users, most cover crop users that planted cereal rye before soybeans saw benefits to their soybean yields and to broadleaf weeds management.
Suppression, yeah. And I think I've actually seen a couple of examples of this where they let the rye grow up pretty tall and then roll it to knock it down and plant right in the middle, so they've got a straw mulch like a person would do in their garden, and the soybean comes up through that, and they preserve moisture and suppress weeds without chemicals.
Yes.
What are some others? We've talked about turnips. What's some of the advantages to the turnips?
The turnips, the biggest advantage that I see is that you can use it for grazing cattle, and cattle will eat those turnips up, and in that experience, you are getting this manure spread all over your land. So that's an added organic matter, added nitrogen, a very good natural benefit of grazing cattle. A
good cycling system there to eat that. And typically, do farmers have to spend a lot of money to do this? Do they fertilize heavily? What's the typical cultural practice?
For specifically turnips and cattle grazing?
For the cover crops generally.
Generally, farmers perceive that cover crops won't cause them a large decrease in profits. Some people think that they won't even see any sort of impact on their income, but what we're seeing is if farmers get creative, take the risk, and see what management techniques work best for them in the long term over 2 to 5 years, they're going to start seeing some yield increases from using cover crops.
The things you've talked about, the microbial activity, the organic matter, all those things are pretty positive.
Yes.
I think there's some government assistance available to do this as well. Can you talk a little bit about that? Are you familiar?
I'm familiar with the NRCS. They have a program to offer assistance for farmers wanting to use conservation practices like cover crops. So you can get, I think, $20 to $30 per acre back for planting cover crops. Now there are certain restrictions and you have to follow their guidelines, but they have those resources online and would be happy to talk with anyone interested about it.
I know one of the restrictions in the past is you couldn't get government assistance to do cover crops and then pasture it, but that's changing as well.
You mentioned that to me, and I think that's a really good thing because we want to see farmers being rewarded for these practices and not penalized.
So it can be in just a regular crop farm rotation, it can be utilized, and like you mentioned on the soybeans where they're just going in and planting, but it could offer a lot of profit opportunity if you can get enough to graze through the wintertime.
Yes, definitely. And if we think about kind of the cost benefit side of this, farmers that plant cover crops strategically might not have to buy as much fertilizer for their fields or as much pesticides if they're seeing their cover crops contribute to pest management.
So it could reduce some costs in other ways.
Yes.
What are there some others? I know part of the strategy is to not just plant a monocultural crop, but to plant a variety.
A mix.
And a mix. What kind of mixes work best, do you think?
I think that a good mix would include both legume species like clovers and grass species. And also, mixes need to be created so that the planting season is well accommodated for. So for instance, I think oats and vetch is a popular mix because oats will grow in the fall and they're probably going to winter kill, especially in Missouri, but then the vetch will probably live and grow into the spring. So you have that cover all year long, but you're not overwhelmed with a multitude of crops growing. And vetch is a legume, whereas oats is a grain crop. So you're going to get some different benefits from each of those growing side by side.
And trying to make this work in a cropping system where we're typically using some herbicides, is that something that the farmers have to be concerned about? Is some interaction there?
Mostly, I think that some farmers use herbicides to terminate their cover crops, right? So I don't know that we would see a lot of disadvantages.
I think what I would warn people about is using a chemical in the spring that will not allow them to plant some of these preferred cover crops in the fall, because some of our chemicals do have restrictions that say no other crop for 10 months or something, and that's really handy because it gives a long season weed control, but it's unhandy if you're going to try to plant something in the fall.
Yeah.
And then wheat can also be used as a cover crop, and there's some restrictions on that from a farm program standpoint. It has to be reported as a cover crop and not reported as a grain crop. Yeah. What are some of the other benefits to cover crops? We've talked about soil erosion, water quality. How does it improve water quality?
So this is a large topic. So we're talking about water quality. We want to think about soil loss and nutrient loss. So cover crops, by keeping the soil in place and scavenging nutrients, will not allow those nutrients or that soil to erode and be displaced into waterways like rivers and streams. But another part of the picture is that cover crops can allow rainfall to actually infiltrate the soil better.
As opposed to runoff.
As opposed to runoff. And in that way, not only benefit water quality, but help the farm in terms of water supply.
It stores that moisture on the farm rather than letting it get off into the riverways, which also prevents any erosion of nutrients or chemicals. So where do you see us going with this? Is this something that is widespread use? I don't believe it is yet.
It's not yet, but I'm very optimistic, and the trends are showing that cover crop acreage is increasing in the United States. I think that a lot of people are really excited about cover crops, but I think that the biggest obstacles are getting information out to farmers and also reaching the right people. Especially in Iowa and Indiana, a lot of farmers might rent the land and they might have only a 1-year lease. So if cover crops show benefits, but not until 2 or 3 years down the line, a farmer renting for 1 year might not want to plant them because they won't see that return.
Well, yeah, because building the soil health over time doesn't necessarily benefit him directly.
Right, but it's really important, and if we can reach landowners and make them excited about that, about building their investment in their land over time, I think that would be a really important tool to increase acreage as well.
I know the program you're working for, there's a lot of discussion about sustainable agriculture and whether it can feed the world and so on. If it can't, then we're in trouble. If it's not sustainable, talk to us a little bit about where you see us going in agriculture. And you're a young person, a different generation than mine. I'd like to get your viewpoint on where we're headed.
In my wildest dreams, I think we would be doing agroforestry across the board. Really diverse plantings with trees intermixed with pasture and crops. But I think for the future, especially in the Corn Belt in the Midwest of the U.S., we're going to have to start using more conservation practices, if only to protect our soil. Because we all are familiar with the Dust Bowl, even though we might not have been around for it, and I don't think anyone is interested in recreating that. So I think living cover all year long will be the first step. I think we're definitely moving that way. I also see a lot of farmers still transitioning from tillage to no-till. And I think that more use of buffer strips around the edges of farms will be highly employed in the coming years.
So there's a lot of things we can do to move in the right direction, at least. I'm kind of interested, as we've visited here, and I kind of introduced you at the beginning, but you're really kind of a city girl who's really evolved into this. Tell us a little bit about how that has worked for you.
Well, so I grew up in Springfield proper, and I don't have an agricultural background, as you say. But there's something about agriculture that presents this amazing entrepreneurial activity that we can both make money and feed ourselves, but also help the environment by being stewards of the environment and protecting the water and our soil and ecosystems. So that is really, I think, what has drawn me to agriculture, because I've always been interested in environmental issues.
And you mentioned a trip that you made to Costa Rica where you spent some time. Tell us a little bit about that. And to me, I've been very fortunate to visit some other places and see how agriculture is in different parts of the world. Tell us a little bit about that experience and how that changed your viewpoint.
Yes, it was a drastic change. I worked on a farm there for 2.5 months, and the farm was in the rainforest in the near Arenal volcano region in Costa Rica. But it was a biodynamic farm, and they employed a lot of agroforestry principles. So it was this very dynamic ecosystem that could also produce food. And that really shifted the way that I thought about producing food and the way that I saw humans in relation to agriculture. And though I think many people would say it's unpractical to think we could do agroforestry on a large scale like that in Costa Rica here in the US, I do think there are important lessons to take from that so we can better our production of food here.
You got to do a TED Talk, which was fascinating, which I got a chance to view. Tell us a little bit about how that came about and how our viewers could maybe access that on the internet.
Yes, that was an opportunity that presented itself this January, I guess. And my colleague Rob Myers and I really wanted to develop a talk about cover crops for the general public, because we want this to be someone that everyone can care about, not just farmers or scientists. So we started to develop that, and I gave it in Colombia, and it's now online. It's a very general overview of the benefits and the role of cover crops, but you can access it on YouTube if you search TEDx Talks and cover crops, an idea worth planting.
Okay. And it sounds to me like there's a lot of resources out there that farmers can access online, obviously, the Extension Office, NRCS. What other resources are out there that you can offer to farmers?
Yes. This is an important question because I think we don't have enough information, but there is so much, so this is good. The Midwest Cover Crop Council has a cover crop decisions tool, and they're in the process of making one for Missouri right now, and that'll be rolling out very soon. So a farmer could go in and think about their restrictions or their desired goals and pick cover crops to plant and decide when to plant them using this tool. There's also, I was just thinking of something and I forgot it.
Well, it sounds to me like here we are at this time of the summer. It's a time to be thinking harvest will be here before you know it.
Yes.
So the application process at NRCS, the lining up your seed, which can be a challenge. One of the things I've found out is it's become more popular. Sometimes the seed is harder to get and a little more expensive.
Yes.
But this is the time where farmers really need to be planning for their fall and winter cover crop decisions, isn't it?
This is prime time, yeah, definitely. And the thing that I forgot, but is really pertaining to this, is that the SARE organization I work for does a survey of cover crop users, and our newest one will be rolling out within the next month.
Okay.
So farmers looking to see what's going on with cover crops should definitely look for that on the SARE website.
Well, Sami, I want to thank you. I know you're working full time on this. You're obviously very dedicated, and thank you very much for coming and visiting with us today. And I hope that folks out there listening might investigate this a little bit and see if it works on their farm. And the consumers kind of watch as farmers adopt this practice, because it's going to be good if it does good for water quality and soil health. That's good for all of us. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for tonight. Sami, thank you very much for coming. Before we go, we'd also like to thank you, our viewers, for tuning in to Show Me Ag. Be sure to tune in next time for another look at a topic touching rural Missouri. For everyone here at KMOS and myself, good night. We're also very interested in what you have to say. So if you have feedback you'd like to share with us, you can email us at showmeag@kmos.org or find us on Facebook.